Hey there, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. In the last video, I talked with you about the Russian counteroffensive in the Kursk region, and I was telling that potentially it's not going completely into the Russian favor as the propagandists and Russian shills were claiming it does. And now, days later, we know the details, and I will gladly share them to you, and spoiler alert, they are not very good for Russians. I'm sorry I'm making this video only now. I was on my trip to the Baltics and it took some time to get back, but now I'm in my studio and at least for the next couple of days I will be here, so more videos will be coming your way. Let's begin with the assessment of the situation in Kursk. Here the setup is relatively simple to understand. Russians did have a partial success of their offensive. Most notably, what they were able to do is they were able to open the pocket that Ukrainians controlled beforehand, and now they have a land corridor allowing Russians to potentially enter or escape the territory of that region where they were trapping significant portion of the Russian troops. However, besides that, things are definitely not going their way. So to recap, once Russians started attacking from around 9th of September, which was about a week ago, they were able to very quickly attack and recapture the settlement of Snagost with a mechanized offensive. It was done both from the north and from the east, and from the west. And now there are also additional reports that Russians have been trying to attack towards Lyubimivka. There is a video about this attack right over here. We can see that they used mechanized columns to go towards Lyubimivka. The problem is the second part of the video that I obviously cannot show you here on YouTube, but you can check it out on the Discord server, is how this column is going to end its existence. And you pretty much can guess how exactly it will be. The point is, Ukrainians, after some initial pushes from the Russians that maybe caught some of the forward-facing Ukrainian positions by surprise, have now regrouped and they are counterattacking the Russian forces. And what we're seeing happening in this area right over here in general is maneuver warfare, where Ukrainians are trying to outmaneuver the Russian advances. Because as much of Russians having a success in this area because they have the advantage in resources, we still need to remember that Russians have big problems in having a solid command chain, and they are struggling catching up to Ukrainians counterattacking. So despite Russians outnumbering Ukrainians in this area 3-1, Ukrainians are actually kicking back and doing some incredible stuff. More specifically, what Ukrainians did is they put additional new dilemma for Russians. Firstly, they started hitting back, so some of the settlements that Russians supposedly initially claimed that they captured going from west to east, Ukrainians have recaptured. They were never fully claimed, but Ukrainians have solidified the control of these settlements once again. Additionally, Ukrainians executed additional breakthrough, and they broken through the southern flank of this Glushkovo area, and now they face a very peculiar situation, because as their forces were located here beyond the river, they were located here to try to control Ukrainians in the east. And a lot of these forces in the center, they moved towards the eastern side, and they tried to supplement the Russian offensive towards the Ukrainian positions. But then Ukrainians essentially kneecapped them and struck them from behind towards the Glushkovo area. Ukrainians are actually supposedly already are in control of the settlement of Veselaya, and they are moving towards the north and towards the east to put Russians in a very difficult position, where they both need to fight the Ukrainian forces that are advancing both from the east, and now Ukrainians that are advancing also from the west, putting them in a very, very tight situation. Moreover, Ukrainians have moved up north and they cut the Russians up north. So the Russians that were moving south to attack towards Snagost now have increased threat of potentially being additionally undercut by the Ukrainian armed forces. So what we're seeing here is essentially Ukrainians, despite the having less numbers, outmaneuvering the Russians and putting them in very bad tactical positions here on the front line. So nothing is over here. Ukrainians are doing great job at trying to undercut and sneak up Russians, and Russians are obviously scrambling to respond to what Ukrainians are doing. They still have the number advantage, but it is extremely interesting to see, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, what it means in total. But another situation that developed was with Ukrainians as they moved up north. They were actually able to completely encircle Russians in a settlement of Kremenaya. So there is right now a certain number of Russian troops that are completely encircled inside of Kremenaya settlement. Now, Russians potentially will try to break through to free these guys. That's what usually Russians have been doing. But we will see. In all case in point, it's great achievement by the Ukrainian armed forces, and President Zelensky has been stating that they have been acting on the Ukrainian plan. But what does it mean? And I'm going to put this comment here from the Telegram channel officer. There is this way of following this war that I've noticed is prevalent in a lot of Western media, also in some military analysts in the West, and in a lot of the laymen's following this war. It's a pendulum style perception on the things on the front line. Because what people have is these major swings where suddenly they think, oh my God, everything is great, the war is going well, Ukrainians are crushing the Russians, and then it swings completely into the opposite direction where everything is bad, Russians are winning, it's a complete disaster, Ukraine should end this war right now. And it's a very unhealthy way of following this war. And I want you all to take away from this video in general is that if you notice that some of the sources of information that you follow have this pendulum type of approach towards covering this war, it's potentially a good sign that you should drop this source of news. Most importantly, for example, here is an Officer Plus channel talking about build analyst Julian Robke and how he's covering the war. And he's a prime example because he's exactly like this. He's covering either Ukraine is winning or then Ukraine is completely losing. And then it's like this pendulum that is swinging back and forth. So when we're talking about the plan of Syrskyi, about the situation in Kursk, there has been a lot of discussion specifically based on this pendulum perception. At first it was like, oh my God, big success, the plan of Syrskyi is winning, and then it's like, well, yeah, but it's not really. So what was the critique? And I feel that potentially this critique could be valid to an extent. So we talked about that Ukrainians have broken into the territory of Russia, and one of the major kind of military goals that everyone would wanted to see is for Russians to deploy significant number of troops in this area so that these troops would be entangled fighting on the territory of Russia rather than fighting on the territory of Ukraine. So that, for example, the planes and plane bombs would be bombing territory of Russia rather than the territory of Ukraine. And for a longer time, the critique was that while Syrskyi's plan was great, that they were able to breach into the Kursk area, that they were able to gain certain ground, it felt that Russians were not dedicating enough forces to this area and essentially stating like, well, like it was able to distract some forces, but it's not enough forces to essentially retake this area, and Russians seemingly are not willing to fight for the area in the Kursk region. So therefore, this signifies that the investment that Ukrainians did with battle-capable units are not paying off. And that was the statement that the same media, the pendulum media, has been stating for a while, that Syrskyi's plan is not great because it's not delivering full what it could deliver if Russians would put more forces on the ground with the aim of recapturing that territory. And then it kind of died down a little bit. Russians accumulated more and more forces in the area, and now Russians are trying to recapture that territory. So now the same media that were first criticizing Ukraine for stating is like, the Syrskyi plan is not working, are also now criticizing and saying is like, well, you see, Russians are actually able to recapture certain villages, and they're able to push Ukrainians out. Therefore, the Ukrainian plan is dog shit because they are not able to defend the territory that they have gained from the Russians. And it absolutely blows my mind because it's literally contrary to specific critique that people were stating before, the same people. Because if we believe Syrskyi and Zelensky as they're stating, that their plan, despite taking a little bit more time because Russia had trouble accumulating resources in this area, they were having trouble figuring out the command chain, but finally they realized that's like, no, we have the resources, let's go and fight. So now they essentially snapped the trap that potentially Syrskyi initially planned this for the whole offensive. And now they are entangling the Russians to actually fight, to actually try and retake some of the Russian captured territory. And with any offensive, that would mean that if Russians have started, that they will need to supply more and more and more resources towards this area, drawing from the resources on the eastern front line of Ukraine, helping Ukrainians to maintain their positions in the eastern Ukraine. So again, what Syrskyi achieved initially was already a big victory, but that last critique is now gone. Russians snapped the plan. They bought in, and supposedly Putin stating that Kursk area needs to be recaptured by the 1st of October. So now they are pouring more resources instead of just trying to maintain the lines of control against Ukrainians. They are now trying to go on the offensive, putting themselves in a vulnerable positions and potentially playing straight into the initial plan of Syrskyi. All in all, Kursk offensive was a great decision. It is still a great decision, and it seems that it is going to be paying not just partially, but full time. Then on some other parts of frontline. So important thing that a lot of people have been stating is that overall, there is a significant slowdown of the Russian movements in the Pokrovsk area. That while Russians right now are having certain success around the southern side, around Ukrainsk here and so on, and they were able to push the Ukrainians out of this pocket, overall, the Ukrainian armed forces are replying that, generally speaking, we are seeing a decrease in overall performance of the Russian offensive. So with September now ending, going into October, most likely we will see an additional 10 to 15% slowdown of the offensive push from the Russians because of the mud season. So not only the Russians are running out of resources, not only the reserves that Russia would love to use on these directions and maybe a lot of other directions, they're now being sent to Kursk direction, but also there will be an issue with the weather for Russians. And that is great. So I still feel that it is potentially possible for Russians to reach Pokrovsk, reach Mirnograd before the end of autumn, but we will see. Overall, remember, 2024 is a defensive year for Ukraine. I believe year 2025 could be a year for victory for Ukraine, but that's going to be my next video. And in generally right now, we see Russians are actually putting a lot of efforts to try to capture certain things. Ukrainians that reinforce this area have been sharing images of quite massive Russian columns actually being used. And this was a big column of Russians that were actually obliterated around the village of Vuhledar there it was right around the area of here where Russians are trying to move forward. And despite Russians advancing a little bit from that big column, which was in total over 46 vehicles, a lot of those vehicles were burned down. Again, I cannot show it on YouTube, but the videos will be on my Discord channel. Join that one. All in all, despite Russian advances, Ukrainians are still executing quite well on their defenses. Russians are doing nothing to change the type of war they're fighting. They're doing nothing to change the way that they're fighting the war. They're not even close to achieving any kind of noticeable change in this war. So despite them taking villages or settlements or certain major logistical points, the war is not over. It's not going to end the war, and Ukrainians are doing a great job at destroying the offenders, and it will again potentially gonna pay off in 2025, and I'm gonna talk about this in the next video. Then there is the topic that I must cover, and everyone in this community should be aware of it, because you need to spread the message all across the internet. So there was this guy that supposedly tried to again shoot Trump, and this guy is a huge grifter. So he is not right in his head. He's mentally ill, which is very, very clearly when you start researching the guy. But Russian propaganda is now working overtime to tie him into the Ukraine bad narrative. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to paint that this guy was in some form associated with the International Legion of Ukraine. The truth of this is that this guy, the Ryan Ruth or Roth, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. So he was a huge grifter. He came to Ukraine. He tried to join all the different meetings, appear in the media, and try to paint him like a big recruiter for Ukraine. However, as soon as there was any kind of verification, for example, he wanted to work officially with the International Legion of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian International Legion just see through what he is, what he represents, and then he said like, no, we will not work with you, my man, like you're not good. So this guy was just spreading the lies. He was pasting himself as he was supposedly a recruiter for the International Legion, which he never was. He never had any official affiliation with any kind of branch of Ukrainian armed forces. Moreover, when he got called out on his lies that he is painting himself as someone that he is not, he actually went on an anti-Ukrainian meltdown and came back to US. So Russians are going to put over time trying to paint that this is some kind of a tie to Ukrainian armed forces. It is not, and you need to help shut down any kind of lies or misinformation that is going to be spread about this by the Russian propaganda. And then finally, if you're still here, if you're watching this, I'm expecting that you potentially like my content. And if you would like to hear more from me, we did a great talk, and like you can say it's a podcast with Artur Rehi while I was in Estonia. We got to sit down. We talked about a lot of topics. First 10 minutes is a little bit of just a trash talk, but you can skip it again. Anyway, listen to it. If you can, give it a watch. I think it's pretty cool. Shout out to Artur Rehi. It was a pleasure. In any case, I love you. Slava Ukraini. Trust in Ukrainian armed forces. And I see you next time.